So Bette Davis and Joan Crawford have regained pop star cult, if you will, by the miniseries Feud from 2017. Bette Davis was played by Susan Sarandon and Joan Crawford by Jessica Lange. And it was immensely successful and highly entertaining and brilliantly set up, produced. The casting was ingenious, and the way the makeup, the costume, the interior decoration. So I would say it's a piece of art. It's very entertaining. I think you can watch it on Amazon Prime. So it's not Netflix, definitely not. So the problem with this mini TV series was that it wasn't 100% accurate as to facts. I mean, it is a biopic with certain aspects like overblown, other facts like misleading. So you have to take it with many a pinch of salt, but still, it's good, particularly for the younger generation who have never heard of Joan Crawford or Bette Davis before, or those of us who haven't seen films with them for many years. Right, so let's start it. So the major issue is the filming of the 1962 movie Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. It was the first cooperation of Joan Crawford and Bette Davis. Joan Crawford always wanted to work with Bette Davis, and she came across a book, a thriller called Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, and tried to find someone to produce this with her and Bette as co-stars. And by that time, both stars were in their mid-50s, and in Hollywood, producers weren't overly keen to bet on very old, almost forgotten stars of the golden era. So it took a time to get the money together, and a producer and a director. And what everyone expected was A, a total flop, a total failure, and B, that the female stars would be at each other's throats all the time, because it's a film about sister rivalry. So it's a former silent screen children's star played by Bette Davis and her much more successful sister, who has to be in a wheelchair on account of a car accident, for which the Bette Davis character was to blame. And these two sisters are forced to live with each other, and Joan Crawford is the victim, and Bette Davis is pretty vile. As you can see, the makeup is horrible, but she came up with the idea by herself, and Bette Davis was never one to fear ugly appearances. She was never a beauty, she was never a glamour star, she was always a character actress. So she really wanted to sink her teeth into that role, and the role was flashier than Joan Crawford's. And lo and behold, this was a huge success and the beginning of a new genre called hag exploitation, which is basically making fun of old women in the horror genre. It's very camp. It's still very popular. And the tragic thing is that both stars hoped that that would invigorate their careers, leading to better and more challenging roles. Turned out both capture that genre and repeated the horror movies. And well, Joan Crawford only had another 15 years to live, whereas Bette Davis lived to the ripe old age of, I don't know, over 80, and she worked right until her death still. This is a very interesting time in their lives, and they got along okayish. They were both really, really professional, always were on time. So Lawrence would have been enchanted not having to work with Marilyn Monroe, who, if at all, showed up like at noon. So they both were real pros. Also, they really had to watch their guard because they knew that the other actress was so talented. So they really had to give their all. And yeah, they weren't friendly. They were just like, you know, like pros, and perhaps something was simmering under the surface. And the movie has it, so the mini TV series claims that they had been feuding for their whole lives, and that's not really credible because they both played different genre types. Both were during their prime under contract in other studios. Joan Crawford at MGM, Bette Davis at Warner Brothers, so there was no need for competition. Still, there was an overlap in the late 40s when Joan Crawford left MGM to work for Warner Brothers, but still, even then, they weren't competing for the same roles. So one should think, oh, brilliant. So a new lease for a kick in the careers for both actresses, but of course, trouble started right after, because Bette Davis was nominated for the Oscar, and if she would have won, it would have been her third Oscar win, which would have made her the first actress to have 3 wins under her belt. And as she quite rightly pointed out, I'm an Aries and I always have to be the first, right? So Joan Crawford wasn't nominated, and she took that personal. She was offended. She argued that she was almost as good as Bette, and just because Bette had the flashier role, and so she really took it personal. What she did then was to ensure that she could announce the best director, and she went to New York to other nominees, Anne Bancroft and now that name escaped me. Hold on. It'll come back. Never mind. But those 2 other nominees were theater actresses playing on Broadway, and they wouldn't have attended the Oscars anyway, because they would have had to cancel performances. So Joan approached these 2 actresses and offered to accept the Oscar in case of they would win, you know. So she made sure that she would be on the stage, absolutely. And lo and behold, Anne Bancroft won for The Miracle Worker. It's a brilliant movie, by the way. It's about a blind girl and her teacher who tries to make the best of her pupil's condition. It's a very physical movie, so there is a lot of fighting going on. It's also a new genre. So the beginning of the 60s was an interesting period movie-wise because everything was changing. So the old glamour days were over, and it was more about realistic depiction of characters. Bette Davis, of course, stood in the wings because she was absolutely sure that she would win the Oscar, and instead Anne Bancroft won, and Joan Crawford walked right so she came from behind. She also waited in the wings, and then she stared Bette Davis in the eyes and then passed her and smilingly, triumphantly accepted Anne Bancroft's Oscar. And after the party, she posed with all the other winners with the Oscar, although it wasn't her. And Bette Davis was furious. And if there hadn't been a feud beforehand, that evening had absolutely the seeds, the makings of a mega feud. And the next chapter was that 1.5 years later, Robert Aldrich, the director of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, wanted to film Hush Hush Sweet Charlotte, also with Bette Davis and Joan Crawford. And Joan Crawford said, you know, why not? Whereas Bette Davis was really adverse to that. And she said, I wouldn't piss on Crawford if she was on fire. I would never want to see that woman again. But Robert Aldrich convinced Bette Davis that it would make good box office. And also Bette Davis played the lead. She was made co-producer, and she was promised $200,000 against Joan Crawford's $50,000. And also she had creative control. And that, of course, was a big mistake, because from day one on, Bette Davis always sat next to the director, commenting on Joan Crawford's performances, undermining her guts. And that was a really horrible atmosphere. And Joan Crawford had to call in sick. So we have a wee bit of a reminiscence of The Prince and the Showgirl, but Joan Crawford never came back. And her aim was to stop the film. So she wanted her revenge for the treatment, and she wanted the film to stop and for Bette Davis to become bankrupt. Well, that didn't happen because a substitute was found. Olivia de Havilland, who was a good friend of Bette Davis and also a heroine from the golden era. And that film also became a huge success, whereas Joan Crawford's reputation suffered greatly after that. So we have two major films and a feud. So Bette Davis always held Joan Crawford in low esteem, because she always thought that she was a real actress, a character actress, whereas Joan Crawford was just like a glamour girl with a lot of makeup on. And this is one of her quotes: "Why am I so good at playing bitches? I think it's because I'm not a bitch. Maybe that's why Miss Crawford always plays ladies," right? Also, when Joan Crawford died in 1977, a reporter called Bette Davis and wanted to comment. And Bette Davis said, "You should never say bad things about the dead. You should only say good. Joan Crawford is dead. Good." So until her dying day, Bette Davis held a grudge against Joan Crawford and went around. So she was never one to hold back. And she always called out other people whom she didn't like. And if you Google that on YouTube, you will find many interviews with Bette Davis where she complains about Joan Crawford having her tricked out of her Oscar win, which she thought would have been legally hers, right? Okay, so what I want to do with you is A, look at the similarities, and B, look at the differences. Because while on the surface, and particularly astrologically speaking, we have two Aries women with Scorpio rising, so it's like a quadruple of Martian energy. They were so different in the way they approached their careers, in the way they created their public personas. And in the end, they weren't so very similar after all, but that was only evident when they were working together, right? So let's start with the similarities. Both Bette Davis and Joan Crawford had daughters who wrote tell-it-all books. Both became bestsellers, but Mummy Dearest was really, really successful. And it started the whole phenomenon of researching child abuse, because before that book was published in 1978, so after Joan was dead, and her adopted daughter Christina didn't inherit anything at all, and she thought, well, this is my idea of taking revenge, and I really want a clean plate. I want it off my chest. And of course, this book is still polarizing. Christina Crawford is still alive and kicking. And there are two teams. There is team Joan Crawford was a monster, and she was a child abuser. She was a violent alcoholic who beat her children. And there is another team who says this is all fiction, and Christina Crawford was just jealous of her mother. Right. It's a wee bit different with Bette Davis, because her only child, so BD Hyman, was her daughter, and she published this book while Bette Davis was still alive and suffering from cancer. And that broke Bette Davis' heart, because that came totally out of the blue. And although B.D. Hyman never told that Bette Davis was physically abusive or a violent alcoholic, there is a lot of gossip going on, and basically saying that Bette Davis was self-involved, manipulative, and not a good mother. So this is an interesting overlap, wouldn't you agree? And we will soon find out why the whole topic of daughter and mother is so important for both Joan Crawford and Bette Davis. Both didn't have too much luck with their husbands, but still had to try it again and again. Joan Crawford's first husband was Douglas Fairbanks Jr., and that was a huge career step for her, because Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks Sr. were Hollywood royalty. So they were sort of like the founders of the silent era. And if you wanted to be accepted on the social ladder in Hollywood, you had to be in their circle. And by marrying their handsome son, she achieved that. Joan Crawford was a social climber, coming from nowhere. I'm going to enlighten you about that soon. But that marriage lasted only for a couple of years. After that, she married Franchot Tone, a very talented. Oh, okay. So Douglas Fairbanks Jr. is the one on the right-hand side top, where she wears the hat and smiles. And then on the right-hand bottom side, that is Franchot Tone. And he was a very talented Broadway actor, and she tried to give him a career in Hollywood, but he didn't fancy movie making, and in the end he went back to New York. He was highly cultivated. So her first husband had all the money and all the connections. Her second husband was very well educated, had fine manners, had excellent taste, and she wanted to become pregnant and had miscarriages from both their marriages. Then by the late 30s, when her career was waning, she married a contract player name of Terry. So that's left-hand side, top corner. And that was a disaster because she really couldn't stand being married to someone with a lower status. So she wanted to become pregnant, and that didn't play out in the end. So she got a divorce. Then there is a big break. I mean, she was always sexually very active. Rumors claim that she was also bisexual. And Joan Crawford was, in particular for a woman in her time, she was acting like normally men would hunt women. So whenever she wanted a man, she got him. She must have had an enormous sex appeal, and the way she looked is really out of touch for the way we look at women today. But during her time, she exuded an enormous sex appeal because she was so self-confident and so glamorous and a very strong woman. But of course, she only appeared to be a strong woman, because we will have a look at her persona as opposed to whom she probably really was in opposition. Then by 1955, she married the boss of Pepsi Cola, Alfred Steele, and she started a new career by becoming vice president of Pepsi Cola, becoming, if you will, the ambassador. But and he was also a millionaire, and she had a very expensive taste. They had a very fancy 8-room, 2-floor apartment on Fifth Avenue, but then he died, leaving her broke. So she had to work again. Right, let's have a look at Bette Davis's husbands. In the middle is her first husband, Ham, and he died falling down a staircase, and there was an inquiry, and it never came out how that really happened. So one myth is that Bette Davis pushed him down the stairs and he broke his skull, right? Also, his middle name was Oscar, and when Bette Davis won her first Oscar in 1935, she looked at the naked golden statue and said, "Oh, it looks like my husband's behind, and his name is Oscar." And from 1936 on, the Academy Award was really called the Oscar, not before, right? Then she fell in love with a man named Sheridan. That's the hunk in the bathing costume. I couldn't resist posting this one because this is really incredible, isn't it? Come on. And that was a very tempestuous relationship, and they were at each other's throats all the time, but also they had great sex, and she became pregnant. So she had her only biological child by him, that infamous BD, who later wrote that Teledol biography. After that, she married Gary Merrill, and they stayed together for 10 years. And he was also the co-star from All About Eve, her major hit comeback film in 1950. And they remained married until 1960. And she really tried to build up a happy family life with him. She adopted 2 other children, a boy and a girl, but that girl unfortunately had to be handed over to an institution because she was retarded. Very sad. But, and that's also something they have in common, Joan Crawford's 2 other adopted daughters only told good things about her as a daughter, and Bette Davis' adopted son is also full of praise. So again, nothing in the lives of Bette Davis or Joan Crawford apparently could be taken without huge pinches of salt, because you never know, right? It's different versions of their childhood, of why they were good mothers versus bad mothers. These are publicity photos. And of course, the Joan Crawford one is more glamorous. They're all adopted. And by the time she adopted her first child, Christina was probably the unwanted baby of an alcoholic prostitute up for adoption. And in 1940, that was a rare case because Joan Crawford was already relatively old, so end of 30s, and she wasn't married. So to give an actress, a single actress, a child was unheard of. So there must have been a lot of money involved, right? Then she adopted a boy, Christopher, and then after a couple of years, 2 siblings. So this is a publicity photo from the end of 1940s. And of course, she sold herself as Saint Joan, the rescuer of unwanted children. And that was a boost for her career. This, of course, is where the glamour side comes in, and where one has to ask oneself, well, if she really meant it by heart, why go so public with that? And as you can see, she holds the little girls like trophies. Can you see that? And they were all wearing matching outfits, Joan and her daughter. So that was really Joan, the professional. Whereas on the left-hand side, we have a different narrative. So this is Bette Davis, middle age, but clearly happy, relaxed. And this is a comparatively private photo, as you can see. It's not glamorous at all. And Bette Davis, by that time, was in her 40s, and she really wanted to enjoy a happy family life because, and this is what made these women so very different. Bette Davis had a very happy childhood. She had a caring mother who supported her all the way through, and they remained close until her mother died in 1960. So her mother was always at her side. Joan Crawford's mother got rid of Joan, or Lucille LeSueur, as she was born, and she was given to a boarding school where she had to earn her keep by scrubbing toilets and waiting on the other pupils. So she really had to scrub toilets, whereas Bette Davis had a really, really loving mother. So that's a huge difference. So you might argue that one actress wanted to repeat the happy childhood, whereas the other wanted to invent something she had never known. Both their fathers disappeared when they were very young. So both had fatherless childhoods, and both had important relationships with their mother. One devoted, the other one ambiguous, a love-hatred relationships. So here is another common denominator. Both had exceptionally long careers. So this is Joan Crawford when she was still Lucille LeSueur, and she came to Hollywood in the 1920s. She had no training background as an actress or a dancer. She had worked in nightclubs, right? And she was a starlet in Hollywood and really, really had to work her way up the hard time. In the 1930s, she was one of the glamour queens. By the 1940s, she had reinvented herself as a sort of like tough, successful business woman, because times had changed. The 1930s had the Depression, and the 1940s were the war and post-war years, and what people wanted to see on the silver screen change. in the 1950s, she became even tougher. I mean, if you Google Joan Crawford and eyebrows, you come up with these pictures. And of course, these are Aries eyebrows. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, you can't be more Aries than that. I mean, these are like literally horns, right? And she had eyebrows like that, but of course they were thickly penciled in. But those were not her original eyebrows, because as you can see, in the 1920s, when she hadn't made up her mind at how she wanted to look, to present herself to the world, her persona, the eyebrows looked very different. Can you see that? So in the 20s, the eyebrows were further down and thinner penciled in. And of course, the pale makeup with a dramatic dark lipstick. And by the end of 1960s, early 70s, she was almost like a caricature of herself. So she really looked like a drag queen. Yeah. So this is really an exceptionally long career, from the 1920s over the 30s, over the 40s, over the 50s, over the 60s. So she really always reinvented herself to stay on top, which is exceptional. I mean, these days with, Nicole Kidman or Helen Mirren or Judi Dench or what have you, that's normal. But in the 1950s and 60s, women over 40 were usually only playing, co-roles, or just weren't big stars anymore. Right. Bette Davis' career spanned even longer because she lived longer. And Bette Davis started off on Broadway. So she had a proper training. Her mother paid for that. And she was discovered for Broadway, and she became a star. And when the silent age turned into talkies by 1929, Hollywood had to let go of many stars because they didn't have good voices, right? And they weren't trained. So they recruited many, many actors from Broadway. And of course, those weren't particularly glamorous because they were trained to be on the stage. They were character actors and actresses, and nobody knew what to do with Bette Davis because she was so unglamorous, right? And it took a couple of years before she could persuade everyone that she was a character actress and she wanted character roles. So by the time Bette Davis started out in Hollywood, Joan Crawford was already a huge star. Then in the 1930s, Bette Davis became the bigger star. She won 2 Oscars. And by the 40s, she was really the queen of Hollywood. She was the queen of Hollywood. But by the mid 1940s, her career became a bit rigid, and also she wanted a child. So she became pregnant, took a year off, and after that, her health had declined a bit and she didn't look the same. So her face had become puffy. So she really looked different. And then she bought her contract out and started a new career in the 1950s, but that only went so-so. Then we have to talk about the 60s and then 70s and 80s, but I have pictures for that. Okay, so before we look at their charts, we must really bear in mind that these two had a very different approach towards their career. So Bette Davis, really, really self-confident, asserted herself and fought with the system, whereas Joan Crawford assimilated herself. So she tried to be the best starlet and the most obliging star. So she was really someone who gave autographs, who answered every fan letter because she absolutely needed the adoration. With Bette Davis, it was more like she was so full of life and she had so much energy, and she was so talented, and she really had to work. So they were both workaholics, but I think fame meant something very different to both of them. All right, let's kick off with Joan Crawford. And I must warn you, there is no proven birth time. If you look it up at Astrocom, you will find a birth date of 1904 or 1906, but Merriman rectified her chart to this one, 1905. And this is the one I always work with, bearing in mind that it's debatable whether this is really holds true. But I think it's a beautiful chart for a very, very determined lady. And of course, we have Aries sun, and please have a closer look. Black Moon Lilith sitting right at the sun in the 5th house of theater and flirting and of glamour, if you will. The sun is at the apex of a T-square, forming a square to Neptune, forming a square to Uranus, and of course Neptune and Uranus make up in an opposition. So of course the sun in a woman's chart can tell something about their relationship with the father, and of course the father was absent. So this is maybe where we have to look when we work with Neptune. So Sun, Neptune is a sort of, there is a hole in someone's inner father figure personality part. So normally a girl needs her father to tell her that she is a princess, that he believes in her, and that he is very proud of her, and so on and so forth. You know that all, of course. On the other hand, the sun is also our own identity. I mean, look at the symbol. It's a sort of dot in a circle, and you can argue that the older we get, the further we travel into the circle and become the inner dot, so to speak, to own the sun symbol, so that we are that we become the sun. If you have a Sun Neptune square, there are many possibilities of what you can become, and it can be fluent, and it can be very creative, it can change, it can become addictive. Joan Crawford did take to the bottle. There is ample proof of that. And she was also a workaholic. But I think that if we talk about addictions, being a workaholic is nothing that is frowned upon in society, because it's rather regarded as something good, right? So yeah, good for you, and you earn your laurels if you will. But if you look at where that's coming from, it's also the whole. I mean, it doesn't matter if you are a kleptomaniac, if you take to the bottle, what have you. The cause, the psychological cause, is always there is a hole that needs to be filled, right? Then, of course, Uranus, and that's like really peppery. I mean, just take that into account. An Aries sun in a square with Uranus, right? So that's like, so the lid can always fly off. Agreed? So it's like a ticking time bomb. And of course, nobody would would lock horns with a person like that. And the Lilith, I think, stands for a woman breaking taboos by living like usually only men do in that time and place, right? Then let's have a closer look at the ascendant. Of course, it's Scorpio, and we have both Moon and Mars in the first house. I mean, the Moon is at 14 degrees, whereas Mars is at 24. So, I mean, I would argue that Liz Green would allow a greater orb so that they are in a conjunction. Also, the Moon is traveling towards the Mars. So why not? I mean, anyway, they're both in the first house and they're both in Scorpio. Mars, of course, is really, really strong in Scorpio, whereas the Moon has a difficult time in Scorpio because it's so possessive. And in the first house, normally people with the Moon in the first house either play a mother figure or look for a mother figure, and sometimes both. Also, since the Moon is so very changeable, it can come in different colors, if you will. So obviously there is a Moon side to her persona and a Mars side to her persona. I think the Moon side absolutely responds to this adopting children, answering fan mail all the time, blah, blah, blah. So of course she becomes a mother figure, someone who seeks adoration, whereas the Mars is of course the warrior, and of course she always tried to fight. So her lowest in life she was when she didn't have anyone to fight against. I mean, remember what I told you last time about Marilyn Monroe, who had also always have someone to fight against so that she would be at her very best, so to prove that she was brilliant, so to speak. Of course, she has Chiron sitting at the IC, making for her miserable childhood. And what I think is very important is the Jupiter at the DC, which of course is the public, and a strong Venus in Taurus. She was very sexy, she was very beautiful, she was very glamorous. And we all know that a Venus in Taurus must have a very hard time in coming to terms with letting go of beauty, of fading. And of course the Moon Venus opposition is interesting as well, because there are obviously like two facets of femininity in Joan Crawford. She was born Lucille LeSueur in Texas, and her mother did the laundry for other people, and she did that in a very small apartment. And little Lucille grew up with a stench of soap, and that must have been really, really claustrophobic. And she had an elder brother whom the mother adored, and as I told you already, she gave sorry, little Lucille away. And the first years in Hollywood, she was under the name Lucille LeSueur. But then a fan magazine ran a contest, and people were to vote on how to name this up-and-coming starlet. And the first place was Joan Arden, but there was already a Joan Arden, so they went to second place, and that was Joan Crawford. So Joan Crawford is not her real name, and she didn't like the name. She thought it sounded like cranberry or crawfish, but then she accepted that. So she assimilated to the star system and gave up her name and of course her Texan accent, and she played around with various personas. Right. So this is Bette Davis, Bette with a Y, and she changed that with an E because it's the heroine of a French novel her mother read when she was a child, but that's it. But the studio wanted to give her another name, Bettina Dawes, and Bette Davis said, no way, Jose, I'm not having it. So she really, really stood her ground, and she remained Bette Davis. This chart is like the real one. So this is this has an approval on so a Rodden approval. So we really can work with this one, whereas the Joan Crawford one, which is interesting because the whole Joan Crawford history and persona is so mysterious. So it doesn't come as a surprise that we don't have her actual birth date, right? By the early 1900s, giving the birth time was mandatory, and I think they didn't register in Texas before 1908, I think. So everything beforehand is a blurb. So interestingly enough, also we have Scorpio rising, we have an Aries sun in the 5th house, of course, right? And here, although they are 3 years apart, of course, Neptune and Uranus have traveled, and Bette Davis is a later Aries, but the T-square she has also. Now, isn't that interesting? So Bette Davis grew up without a father, and Bette Davis also played with different personas. The difference is Bette Davis really played them on the screen. She did a bit of theater as well, and that was it. In private, she was really authentic, and she wasn't glamorous. She wasn't pretending to be anyone she was not, but she loved to play, and she really became her characters. So we have 2 ways of embodying a Sun Neptune square. And I think the major difference is that Bette Davis knew who she was because her mother had such deep faith in her, always had her back. Whereas Joan Crawford had to invent herself. So that's a major difference, right? But both are Sun Neptune issues, wouldn't you agree? Also interesting is we have a Moon Pluto conjunction, and I would be so bold as to say that the Moon is nearly at the cusp of the 8th house. So why not, push it to the 8th house and make it a conjunction with Pluto? So we have Joan Crawford with Pluto in 8, and we have Bette Davis with Pluto in 8, with Davis, who was really argumentative, by the way, very typical of a moon in Gemini. And then we have a Venus-Mars conjunction, and Venus is already in Gemini, whereas Mars is still in Taurus. So we have both planets sitting at critical degrees, right? And I've done a lot of research on Venus conjunction Mars, and if you look in the cookbooks, you might find these are very passionate people. These are people who really only fall a couple of times in love, and then in a very passionate way, but not in a lukewarm way. So there is no way of ever coming across lukewarm feelings. So it's either hot or cold. So that's one way of a definition of Venus-Mars conjunction. But I would argue that this is a completely different kettle of fish because they are in different signs. So Venus is already in Gemini, which is good for an actress, I presume, whereas Mars is in Taurus. And remember, Joan Crawford had Venus in Taurus versus Bette Davis had Mars in Taurus. And both had a very intense sex life, with the difference that Joan Crawford had lost her virginity when she was a teenager, She had been harassed by her stepfather, versus Bette Davis on her wedding night when she was 25 was still a virgin, right? Because she was brought up proper and prim in Puritan New England. So very strict upbringing, right? So also what I find interesting is that the North Node is in Cancer, in the 8th house as well, sitting at Neptune. Can you see that? So this longing to become a mother and also to experience a healthy, relaxed domestic home could be found here, I would argue, right? So the South Node, hold on, North Node, 9 degrees, yeah. So the South Node is in the 2nd house in Capricorn. So if you do karmic astrology, you might argue that she came from incarnations where she knew her value, 2nd house, and where she was in charge, right? Capricorn. So this is what she was born with, if you will. Whereas the North Node indicates where her journey has to go. And of course, since her 8th house is already so very full, a life of crises and always trying to stand your ground, makes perfect sense. Okay, so this is Bette Davis's mother, Ruthie, and she lived with Bette Davis until her death. And this is Lucille LeSueur's mother, a very ambivalent relationship. And she was very poor, and Joan Crawford paid for her keep, but they didn't live together. Also, I mean, if you look at the way Joan Crawford looks here, this is very untypical because Joan Crawford glare is usually very sexy or very self-confident, and here this look is very doubtful, wouldn't you agree? And these are publicity photos because she had to prove that she had a mother and blah blah blah. An interesting parallel to Marilyn Monroe, by the way. Okay, so Joan Crawford's first persona was the flapper girl or the jazz baby. The 1920s, the roaring 20s, were really a time of liberation after the First World War, and women cut their hair. They wore bobs. They started to smoke in public. They wore heavy makeup. The skirts were short, and they were all dancing like mad. So the black bottom, the Charleston, and Joan Crawford wasn't a particularly talented dancer. She didn't have any training. So she went to dancing school every night, and she went to competitions in nightclubs. And then she got bigger and bigger parts. And by 1929, she was the star of a film called Our Dancing Daughters. That was one of the hits of 1929. And she could sing. She hadn't a very carrying voice, but her voice was okay. So she was one of the stars who didn't have much to lose by transitioning from the silent era to the talkies, because yeah, that was a natural transition to her, right? So this is really interesting. Look at how wild she is, and I think it's absolutely intoxicating. And I think that holds true for London as well as for Berlin. And we also and we always seem to idolize the time between the wars. And of course, in hindsight, we knew that horrible times were to come afterwards. I mean, not so much for the US, but in particular for us in Europe here. So to really live your life to the fullest. And of course, it's a cliche because we are talking like a really, really tiny niche. I mean, the majority of the population was incredibly poor in the 1920s. Right, so this is a Joan Crawford quote, really interesting. I had always known what I wanted, and that was beauty. So please think of the Venus-Jupiter conjunction in the 7th house in Taurus, right? In every form, a beautiful house, beautiful man, a beautiful life, and image. I was ambitious to get the money which would attain all that for me. Right. So she, alongside Greta Garbo, Jean Harlow, Norma Shearer, Marlene Dietrich, was one of the most beautiful and celebrated 1930s stars. So she really, really was a star. And by the way, I included on the right top hand side a very untypical image of her because she had a tan and was bleached blonde. Can you see it? So that is really contra her usual type. And she only had that in 1 year. I think that was 33. And after that, she never returned to that look because that was a mistake, right? But she never shied away of trying to become even more glamorous. And what the roles she played in the Depression era was usually like shop girls who met a rich man and made her way to the top. So audience identification, like different from Marlene Dietrich or Greta Garbo, who were like goddesses. So she always had a nicely earthy flavor to it. I mean, we're talking Aries sun here, right? So that's the typical 1930s. Okay. So by now we have to talk about her cleaning obsession. Joan Crawford was really, really extreme when it came to personal hygiene, when it came to cleaning. And she even had plastic covers on her furniture so that you won't touch the actual fabric, right? And all of her houses, all of her apartments were legendary because she had them done by her best friend Billy Haynes, a gay actor who wasn't very successful, and she persuaded him because he had such impeccable taste to become an interior designer, and he decorated almost all the houses in Hollywood in the 1930s and 40s. I mean, this is the Art Deco style. And the thing with Joan Crawford's houses always was that they weren't particularly cozy. So you really didn't want to slouch around on a sofa. So they all looked like film sets, right? It's a gorgeous picture of her cleaning the kitchen floor. Look at that. Brilliant, isn't it? I mean, she was only rivaled in that department by Marlene Dietrich, who was known to, you know, scrub floors on her knees. Okay. Right. So these are pictures from Bette Davis's career in the 1930s and 40s. And the most amazing thing about her was that she never shied away of playing unsympathetic villainesses, really vile women, and she always wanted to look the thing. So in one film, she was supposed to die, and she insisted that she got rid of all her makeup. So she really wanted to look the part, like she was really dying. And in the next film, she was supposed to be beaten up by a gangster band, and she paid a visit to her doctor and said, please make my face that it will swell up. So he I don't remember what he did. I think he pushed something into her nose and added a compression to her face, so she really looked the part. And that was unheard of at that time because every actress wanted to look glamorous at all time. Her second Oscar she won for Jezebel, where she plays a Southern belle, and that was she was given that role because she wasn't given the role of Scarlett O'Hara for Gone with the Wind, which she never forgot. So she hated Vivian Leigh because she got the part of Scarlett O'Hara, and she wasn't even American, right? And the funny thing about this is that her first success was in playing Of Human Bondage by Somerset Maugham, and she played a Cockney waitress. So she acquired a Cockney accent. Bette Davis was so talented that she could do a Cockney accent, and later on she played Queen Elizabeth I twice, where of course she had a British accent. I don't know if you know films like Now Voyager, Mrs. Skeffington. I mean, these are really, really Watch on the Rhine, The Old Maid. I mean, brilliant. These films haven't necessarily aged well because we might feel a bit alienated, but still, it's always joyous to watch Bette Davis and actresses like Susan Sarandon and Meryl Streep always said that Bette Davis was their favorite actress, right? Okay, by the 1940s, she had ups and downs, and her last film at Warner Brothers, Beyond the Forest, and the advertisement for the film read, "Nobody's as good as Bette Davis when she's bad," because she played a bitch again, of course, but she found that film so tacky that she bought herself out of the contract. The image from the top right-hand side is from the Hollywood Canteen. I don't know if you ever heard of that. And Bette Davis organized that all the GIs who were on leave could actually have a good time out, have a dance, have a drink, and meet actual Hollywood stars and hang out with them. So that was her idea, the Hollywood Canteen. So she really, yeah, larger than life. Okay. By the mid-1940s, Joan Crawford's career was waning, and she bought her contract out of MGM. And for 2 years, she didn't work. And then she came across a proposition, which Bette Davis had turned down, called Mildred Pierce. And all the other actresses had turned that part down because it was a mother of a 20-year-old daughter. So that would make the actress really be in her 40s. And Joan Crawford said, I think I can make something out of it. And by 1945, when the war was over, what she played in that film, so she had a chain of burger, selling burgers and then make a chain of it. So a successful businesswoman with a daughter and affairs. So a new kind of woman, a new kind of persona. And that was so successful that she won her first and only Oscar. Other films, humoresque, possessed, and she played always a desirous woman with younger men, so also very unheard of. By the 1950s, her image was really frozen, and then, so what I would argue, the drag queen era began, and all the 1950s movies with Joan Crawford, you cannot watch them without promptly recognizing a strong element of camp. She really looks like a drag queen. Everything is exaggerated, the way she talks, the way she looks, the way she smokes, the way she drinks. And it's almost inconceivable that these movies were made, that they were successful, and that people actually went to the movies paying good money. My idea is this was so incredible and so unheard of, and everyone always wagering like, is she going to pull it off again? and again and again. Oh my God. She must be in her 50s now, and she's still pulling it off. So really extreme. Also kicking and dancing. In one film, Torch Song, she even has black facing. So this is really incredible. This is so camp. I mean, you really wouldn't believe it. With Bette Davis, a wee bit different, because by the early 1950s, she reinvented herself with All About Eve. I'm sure you've watched that film. And that was also one of the first films of Marilyn Monroe. So interesting, right? And by the way, she even came late to the set when she was a starlet. So, you know, the usual patterns. She fell in love with her co-star, Gary Merrill. And yeah, these are other pictures from Joan Crawford, who was also famous for slapping people in her movies. Look at it's a really oh, slap, slap, slap. This is the campus thing I've ever seen. So it's highly entertaining, really. Okay. By the 1960s, also Bette Davis had to resort to this sort of like B movies, and I told you before, the genre was called hag exploitations, and with few exceptions, for example, Death on the Nile, you know, the Agatha Christie film where she plays with Maggie Smith. I'm sure you watched that. So she had some prestige roles, but she also had to deal with a lot of crap. But she wanted to earn money, and she also wanted to act. These are the last rows of Joan Crawford. I mean, like really extreme. Look at that. Really extreme. All right. So let's have a look at the synastry and why they really got under each other's skin. Okay, first of all, so BD is the outer wheel. So Bette Davis's Saturn sits at Joan Crawford's sun. And by the way, it doesn't matter whether she was born in 04, 05, 06, or even 07. The sun would always be at around about 2 degrees, right? Doesn't matter. And Bette Davis's Saturn would always sit at her sun. This is interesting because this is really so if you will, reigniting the T-square of Joan Crawford, wouldn't you agree? Also, Joan Crawford's Mars is in opposition with Bette Davis's Mars, and since Bette Davis's Mars always comes with her Venus in tow, this is really extreme. And I think what Bette Davis might always have envied was that Joan Crawford was way more glamorous, way more beautiful, and also always more desirable. And of course, that is a Mars opposition, right? So the way they approached life, Bette Davis once said, if there is no man to hold the door open for you, you just have to kick the door in. Otherwise, you know, you won't get anywhere. And Joan Crawford was similarly, but she always tried to be glamorous. Also, we have a Jupiter square. And of course, both ladies were way, way, way over the top. So like really extreme, larger than life. Then, of course, Joan Crawford's Pluto squares Bette Davis's Mercury. So this is the bitch fest, if you will. Pluto square Mercury. Oh my God, I'm 15 minutes over time. Is that true? But you know, I think we could.
Yeah, you're going on a bit. I think you
Sorry.
because it's our last one. You want to go out with a bang.
Oh, I did. Sorry, guy. Sorry.
It's okay. Yeah, if you as quick as possible, but yes.
Yeah. So, do me a favor, because there are a lot of free Joan Crawford or Bette Davis movies available for free on YouTube. So it's very pleasurable. and you could watch that on your laptop while washing up. Also, it's highly entertaining. It's highly entertaining because, and that's almost like watching an old Marilyn Monroe movie. I think the old magic is there. The other night I watched an old James Dean movie and I was absolutely mesmerized. I mean, these Hollywood stars, they really, really had it. I mean, come on, they really had a sparkle. And it's so entertaining also because it's slightly morbid. I know many of you know that I'm an eighth house person. And I think there is something morbid in watching a movie with someone who is long, long gone and watching him or her in his or her prime. There is something fascinatingly morbid. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, coming to think of it, I mean, it's morbid enough if one looks at old pictures of oneself, but you know what I'm saying. All right. I think the next time I will see you guys, it will be in the flesh, right?
Oh, that would be great.
I think it's end of May, Wanda.
Yes, I saw. Yeah, I can't remember the date, but
22nd of May.
yes, May. Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, because
and I will miss you.
Oh.